My name is Valen Thorne. I am 34 years old and I live in a small apartment not far from the house I grew up in. For 5 whole years I worked really hard and saved almost every extra dollar I had to pay off one very big thing. The $680,000 mortgage on my parents' house. Every time I got paid I made sure that the money went toward that house. I told myself it didn't matter if I didn't buy something I wanted or go on a trip. It didn't matter if I had to skip fun things with friends or stay late at work. That house mattered more. I always thought that when I made the last payment, there would be a special moment. Maybe a small dinner with my parents. Maybe my dad would say, "Valen, I am so proud of you. You saved the house for all of us." I pictured us all laughing in the kitchen together. I pictured feeling warm inside, proud that I had done something really big, something no one else had done. I imagined the smile on my mom's face, the quiet pride in my dad's eyes, and maybe even my brother smiling at me in a way that said he finally understood. But that's not what happened. "Dad, I got a phone call." My dad didn't even say hello. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't talk about the weather or anything like that. He just said, "I know you paid off the mortgage. All of it. But we are giving the house to your brother as a graduation present. And you are not invited to the party. I don't want you bringing your attitude into his big day." I froze. My hand stayed pressed to the phone. My mouth went dry. My heart started beating fast. I stared at the wall and thought I must have misheard him. Surely he couldn't mean what I thought he meant. My brother Cale had taken it easy in school while I worked double shifts to keep the house from falling into the bank's hands. And now I was the problem? I asked my dad if he was serious. He said I was making everything about money and that my family should just be happy for each other. Then he hung up. The line went dead. I just sat there staring at the phone in silence. The world felt strangely quiet. Everything I had worked for, every sacrifice I had made, every late night and extra shift, it didn't matter to him. It was like it had never happened. I couldn't understand it. My brother hadn't worked for the house at all. He hadn't paid a single penny. And now the house, the very house I had saved, was going to be his gift. And they didn't even want me at the party. I finally turned to the only person who knew the truth about all those payments and asked, "Do you want to tell them or should I?" 3 days later, my brother's graduation arrived. But it didn't feel like a celebration. I didn't feel happy. Felt wrong. Before I tell you exactly what happened at that party, I want to say something. If you have ever felt invisible in your own family, if you have ever worked hard to do the right thing and felt like no one noticed, press the like button and subscribe so you can hear the rest of my story. This story is for everyone who has felt invisible, for everyone who has been left out even when they tried their best. There was a time when news like that would have hit me just as hard. I would have swallowed it, smiled and said I was fine. I would have pretended nothing bothered me. But that reflex, that automatic everything is fine response, didn't appear overnight. I had learned it over many years slowly as I figured out how my family worked. I grew up in a 2-story house on a quiet street in Rochester, New York. That house was always there in every memory I had. It was the background for birthdays, for slammed doors, for late-night talks, for laughter, for tears. My dad, Alaric Thorne, loved that house. He ran a small auto repair shop on the edge of town. He liked to see himself as the man who kept other families moving, fixing their cars, keeping their lives running. But at home, most of his attention went to my younger brother, Cale. Even when the house was old and falling apart, even when the shop was barely making enough money to pay for repairs, my mom, Isolde Thorne, moved between the two of us, trying to smooth things over. With me, she assumed I could figure things out. With Cale, she assumed the world would make room for him. By the time I was a teenager, I had learned not to ask for help. If there was money for a school trip, it went to my brother. If there was a new jacket, he got it first. I learned to adapt. I learned that my needs came last. I learned to be quiet. I studied. I took part-time jobs. I focused on building a life that didn't depend on my parents. When I left for college, that habit grew stronger. I worked hard, sometimes 2 jobs, sometimes 3, just to pay for my life. I rented small apartments, drove old cars, and cooked at home. I told myself that independence was worth more than any help my family could give me. Back in Rochester, my dad's shop started struggling. Business slowed down. A costly repair on his own equipment wiped out a month of profit. A harsh winter made people delay repairs. The mortgage slipped behind. I could hear the strain in my parents' voices whenever I called. One visit home, I accidentally opened the wrong drawer in the kitchen. Inside, I found a thick stack of unopened letters from the bank. None of them had been opened. Standing there, holding those letters, I understood how close we were to losing the only stable place we had ever had. I could have walked away. I could have gone back to my apartment and let them face whatever came. But I didn't. I went to my old bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed and did the math. I knew what I earned. I knew what I could spend less on. If I poured a huge part of my paycheck into that mortgage, my own life would slow down. Promotions, raises, trips, and little luxuries would belong to someone else. But I chose to do it anyway. The payments started quietly. Every month, money left my account and chipped away at a balance that didn't even have my name on it. My dad talked about holding on to the family home as if it was all his fight. My mom thanked me in small, private ways, like a home-cooked meal when I visited or a message saying she loved me. But she never pushed my dad to admit what I was doing. When things got especially hard, my Uncle Bastian stepped in. He helped my parents sign papers that tied the house and the loan to a more protected arrangement, as long as the payments kept going. My name appeared in those papers, linked to responsibilities I was already carrying and to rights I barely thought about. I told myself it was enough just knowing my parents could sleep at night without worrying about losing the house. For a long time, paying the mortgage became routine. Work, bills, transfers, small relief when I saw the balance shrink. I told myself that when the debt was gone, things between my parents and me would finally feel like respect instead of obligation. I watched Rochester move through its seasons from my apartment window. Snow turned to slush. Trees burned orange and red, then went bare again. Each change outside matched another payment I sent, proof I was still holding up a house I didn't live in. On weekends, I drove back to the old street. Outside, nothing looked different. The siding still needed paint. The front steps still creaked. Inside, though, I felt the gap growing. My dad talked more about his sacrifices, his pride, and how proud he was to keep the house. My role stayed unspoken, tucked into the same drawer where he kept the bank letters. When Cale's last year of college started, everything in that house tilted toward him. Phone calls revolved around his classes, his plans. My mom asked me to come to his graduation because she wanted pictures of both of her children. My dad planned a party and called it a fresh start for the family. By then, the mortgage was almost gone. I knew how many payments were left. I pictured the moment when the last one cleared. In my head, it was simple. We would gather in the kitchen. My parents would open the letter from the bank. The three of us would share the same understanding of what had been saved and who had saved it. I didn't expect a big speech. I just hoped for honesty. But the reality that followed felt nothing like that. There was no kitchen scene, no shared relief. There was only the bare fact that the loan was finally cleared and the sense that my parents had planned a celebration that did not include me for a house I had saved. The idea that something was deeply wrong settled in my chest. I could have told myself to be grateful that the house was safe, but it sounded different now, like someone else had written my story. I pulled out the trust documents from my closet and read them properly. My name sat on those pages, tied not just to responsibility but to future control of the property. The house was not some vague family thing. It was tied to the choices I had made and the money I had sent. I went to see my Uncle Bastian Thorne again. He had pushed my parents to protect the house when things were at their worst. The one person who had insisted that if I carried that burden, it needed to be recognized. Sitting across from him, I realized he had always assumed I understood how much power those papers gave me. I left that meeting with a sharper picture than I had ever had. The house I had been paying for was not a prize my dad could hand to my brother just because he wanted to. It was an asset anchored to my choices, my sacrifices, and my name. For the first time, I stopped planning how to keep the peace and started thinking about what it meant to stop letting other people edit me out. Graduation weekend arrived. It didn't feel like a milestone for my brother. It felt like a test of how completely I could be written out of my own work. That Friday night, I drove onto my parents' street and noticed something different. Cars were parked along the curb, almost touching each other, and it looked like almost everyone had come. The porch was covered in twinkling string lights that made the house look like it was glowing. Above the front door, a big colorful banner had my brother's name on it. From the outside, the house looked cheerful and happy, like a story where everything worked out because someone had worked really hard and earned it. When I stepped inside, the first thing I noticed was the noise. The sound of people talking, laughing, and moving around filled every corner of the rooms. Relatives held paper plates with food and plastic cups with drinks. Everyone seemed excited and everyone seemed busy talking to someone else. A few people came over and hugged me. They looked surprised to see me there, but only for a moment. Almost immediately their attention went back to my brother. All around me people were asking him questions and praising him. They wanted to know where he might work, what kind of apartment he would get, how he would set up his new place, and what he should do with the yard once he moved in. The house, the very same one I had been helping pay for month after month, seemed to belong to him now. No one even seemed to think about me. They were simply repeating what my parents had told them. My father walked through the crowd telling his version of the story. In his version he was the hero. He said he had kept the family together and worked hard through tough times. My mother stayed nearby, topping off drinks, nodding at the right moments and making sure everyone was focused on him. Neither of them said anything about the money I had given to pay the house off. Across the room my Uncle Bastian watched quietly. He wasn't part of the noise or the chatter. He knew the truth. He had seen all the papers that showed who had really been paying the mortgage and how the house had been legally set up. He also understood that my father didn't want anyone else to know that night. Finally, my father called everyone into the living room. People squeezed onto the couch and lined the walls. He stood by the fireplace and spoke about the house as if it were the heart of the Thorne family. He told them they had worked through hard years and he believed his son would carry things forward. Then he said the words I had been waiting to hear. The house would be my brother's graduation gift, the foundation for his future. Hearing that in front of everyone made it feel heavier than before. It wasn't just a private insult anymore. Everyone present was being asked to agree that my hard work didn't matter. Before that story could settle into the room, Bastian stepped in. He spoke calmly and in plain words. He reminded my father that the house wasn't something you could just give away with a toast. He talked about the trust that had been set up when the bank letters came and the legal structure that existed because someone else had been making the payments. He didn't say my name, but it was clear who he meant. Several people turned to look at me. The mood in the room changed in small ways. The applause my father had expected never came. People began leaving earlier than they usually would. My father tried to brush off Bastian's words, saying it was only a technical point and that everyone knew what he meant. He let the night slowly come to an end. I drove back to my apartment feeling different. I had a kind of clarity I hadn't felt before. If I left my story in my parents' hands, all my work would stay invisible. If I wanted to protect what I had done, I would have to do it myself. A few days later, I went back to the house alone. The lights were gone. The banner had been taken down. The street was quiet again, almost like nothing had happened. I went to the front steps and slid my key into the lock, but it stopped halfway. The lock had been changed. That small resistance told me something my family wouldn't say to my face. When the door opened, my brother was there, standing behind moving boxes. He didn't need to say anything. The way he stayed halfway inside, the way his eyes flicked from my useless key to me, spoke clearly. Whatever the house meant now, it didn't include me. The door clicked shut. I stood on the porch holding a key that no longer worked and understood something important. My next move wouldn't be another compromise. It would be the start of a boundary my family had never expected. The quiet after that locked door came home with me. It didn't feel like confusion anymore. It felt like a decision my family had made, and I was finally seeing it without excuses. The useless key sat in the middle of my coffee table. Now it was just metal, a reminder of how much of my life I had poured into a house I could no longer enter. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the porch, the new lock, my brother standing in the doorway as if the space had always belonged to him. The warm story I had told myself about helping my parents sounded thin and tired. The next morning, I pulled the storage box from under my bed and carried it to the kitchen table. I emptied it until the table was covered in papers. There were statements, emails, copies of mortgage notices, proof that I had not imagined anything. Every page marked a moment when I had chosen my parents' comfort over my own. I added the trust documents my Uncle Bastian had pushed them to sign. I read them slowly like I was reading a contract instead of a favor. My name was written in the papers, tied not just to responsibility but to future control of the house. The house wasn't just a family symbol anymore. It was connected in writing to the money I had already spent. For the first time, I treated the situation like work. I made a list of what I couldn't change and what I actually controlled. I couldn't make my parents fair. I couldn't make my brother grateful. I could only decide where my money went and how my name appeared on anything tied to the house. That list led me to attorney Lucian Calethorpe. I brought the folders and set them on his desk. I laid out the sequence of events without softening them. He looked at the paper trail instead of the family drama. He pointed to parts of the documents that allowed me to block transfers, freeze any attempts to move ownership, and make sure any formal decision about the house involved me. Hearing it framed in neutral words removed the last bit of doubt I had. On paper, I was not an emotional daughter overreacting to a party. I was the person who had cleared a huge debt and had the legal safeguards to protect the house. I called my cousin Zyra Thorne, who worked with financial records and knew messy properties well. She confirmed that my father had already started pushing the house toward my brother. It wasn't confusing. It was a calculated risk based on the belief that I would stay quiet. Later, I stopped by our old neighbor Amara Valen's small house across from my parents. She had watched our family for years and could notice when serious changes were happening behind the polite version. She understood that letters or unfamiliar cars might start appearing and that those details would matter. That night, I put the papers back into neat stacks and slid them into their folders. I put them on the shelf where I could reach them easily. They didn't feel like old records anymore. They felt like tools. I was done waiting for my parents to suddenly be fair. Whatever happened next would depend on me and how far I was willing to go to protect the part of the story that actually belonged to me. By the time our extended family gathered near the water for the usual summer cookout, the house no longer felt like a background. It felt like a line someone was trying to push me behind. The park was near Lake Ontario. Folding chairs were around the grills. Kids ran back and forth between coolers and swings. Relatives exchanged the same greetings they always did each year. On the surface, it looked like just another Thorne family gathering. But this time, almost every conversation turned toward my brother. People asked him about jobs, apartments, and plans for the next few years. The house came up in talks like a prize waiting at the end of a game he had barely played. I listened as my father repeated the story he liked best. In his version, he worked through hard times, kept the family together, and now got to see his son step into a safe future. When relatives asked how they had managed to hold on to the house, he said they just tightened their belts and believed things would get better. My name didn't fit anywhere in that story, so he left it out. My mother stayed close to him, refilling plates, adding little comments, and making sure everyone's attention stayed on him. I walked around the edges of the gathering, listening quietly. I noticed how everyone laughed at my father's jokes and how they nodded at the same stories he had told 100 times. No one mentioned the months I had spent sending money to pay the house off. No one thought about how my work had made this possible. It was like I hadn't been part of the story at all. Every time my brother spoke, people hung on his words. They asked him what he wanted to do with the house, if he would fix the yard or how he planned to decorate. They didn't know that I had already carried the house through the hard years. To them it was all a gift, a lucky prize. I felt something inside me shift. It wasn't anger yet. It was clear. I understood that if I wanted my story told, I couldn't wait for my parents or my brother to tell it. I had to tell it myself. And if I wanted to protect what I had done, I would need more than words. I would need proof, tools, and action. The sun was warm that day, but I didn't feel it on my skin. I watched the lake glint in the distance. The smell of the grills and the sound of children laughing mixed with the voices of relatives talking about my brother. Everything was beautiful and ordinary, yet under it all was the quiet truth I had learned. The house was mine as much as it was theirs. My work had built it, and no story or celebration could change that. I went back to the table in my apartment later that evening. I spread out the folders again, reading each page, checking every statement, email, and mortgage notice. Every number, every date, every document reminded me of the time I had given, the money I had spent, and the responsibility I had carried. I traced the names and clauses, seeing my name written in the agreements, tied to the house in ways no toast, no celebration, no banner could undo. I realized that for the first time, I wasn't just waiting for my family to recognize my efforts. I was in charge of the story. I could protect the part that was mine. I could make sure that any decision about the house had to include me. I wasn't powerless anymore. I had tools, I had evidence, and I had control over what mattered. That summer, while everyone else laughed by the lake and the smell of grilled food filled the air, I made a quiet promise to myself. I would no longer leave my work in their hands. I would no longer let the story be rewritten without me. And if anyone tried to move me out of it, I had the power to stop them. She talked about how happy she was that my brother was moving into the house. She said it made her feel good that the house would stay in familiar hands. To anyone listening, it sounded like a simple, nice choice. It sounded like a happy family moment. But the truth was more complicated. The agreements and the years of payments were hidden, buried in papers that most people never saw. I had not come empty-handed. I carried a thin folder in my bag. It was the same one that had sat on my kitchen table while I went through every paper, every rule, and every clause. I had no plan to wave it around. I just wanted to make sure that my dad's story did not become the only truth without me saying anything. When some relatives sat down at one of the picnic tables and the talk went back to the house, I felt a choice appear. I could stay quiet, nod along, and let the story be accepted as it was. Or I could show something that would not let it sit quietly. I took out the folder. I opened it to a page that had my name written next to the rules of the trust. I set it carefully on the table. I watched as eyes moved from the paper to my father and back to me. In that small circle, the idea that the house had been a simple gift started to break apart. Questions came quickly. Enough questions to disturb the smooth story my parents had prepared for everyone. Relatives who had assumed the story was straightforward started to see that pieces were missing. My dad tried to wave it off, saying it was just legal fine print. My mom tried to steer the conversation back to lighter topics, to make things feel cheerful again. But the mood never fully returned to the warmth they wanted. The cookout went on, but something underneath had shifted. A few cousins pulled me aside later. Small messages appeared on my phone that evening. People who had once accepted my dad's version by default now realized there was more to the story, even if they did not say it out loud. A day or two later, my brother posted a short video. He stood in front of the house, pointing at the porch and the windows as if showing off a finished project. The caption made it seem like it was the beginning of his life there, and that our parents were proud of him. Comments poured in from friends and family, full of congratulations and plans to visit. Watching it from my apartment, I saw a public story being told about a place that had already cost me more than most people would ever know. My part in that story disappeared with every reaction. I did not respond. I did not correct anyone. I closed the app, looked at the folders lined up on my shelf, and let the quiet in my apartment confirm something I had been realizing for a long time. I was finished playing along. In the days before my brother's celebration, my schedule stayed the same, but my focus changed. I stopped hoping for a last-minute apology. Instead, I started treating everything ahead as follow-through on the decisions I had already made. The folders on my shelf were no longer just background clutter. They were the boundary I intended to hold. They were proof of the work I had done and the truth I was ready to protect. On the morning of my brother's big day, my cousin Zaira confirmed that the filings Lucian had prepared were live in every system that mattered. My years of payments, my name, and the trust my Uncle Bastian helped create were now officially recorded in places my parents could not rewrite with a story. For the first time, the version of events I had lived through stood next to theirs in something more permanent than memory. Later that morning, city officials walked up to the front steps of the house I had funded. Amara watched from across the street. My parents opened the door expecting early guests, but instead received formal notice that the property was under review. The house could not be handed over as a simple gift while the trust existed and a dispute was active. The people on the porch did not know anything about favoritism or family speeches. They just saw a trail of documents and obligations that could not be ignored. Amara told me that my dad's confidence slipped in a way she had never seen. For years he had assumed his version of events was the only one that would ever matter. The envelopes left in his hallway said otherwise. Around midday, a tow truck arrived for my brother's car. The lease he had treated as a symbol of his smooth future was behind on payments, and there was no one left to quietly cover the shortfall. Early guests watched in awkward silence while the car was pulled off the driveway and taken away. For once, the cost of his choices landed where it belonged instead of rolling toward me. That afternoon I drove back to the old street. Lucian met me with a slim stack of documents. My Uncle Bastian joined us with the folder that tied the house to the agreement he had insisted on when my parents were desperate. Walking up the path between them, I felt nervous, but I also felt finished. I was not there to ask for a place. I was there to enforce the one I already held. My parents answered the door with my brother behind them. Lucian laid out the present situation in calm, plain language. The trust would be enforced. The house could not be treated as my brother's personal gift while the dispute remained open. Any change in control would now require my consent. A short window was set for them to remove their belongings while a locksmith changed the locks. Where they went next would be their responsibility, not mine. In the weeks that followed, they adjusted to circumstances that finally matched their choices. My father and mother moved into a modest rental on the other side of town. My brother shared an apartment with people who judged him by what he did each day, not by promises my parents had made about his potential. The house stayed where it had always been, but it no longer served as a prop in a story I was expected to applaud. I finished the repairs, met with Lucian and Bastian, and decided how to use the property by asking a simple question I had ignored for years. What would serve my life best? The answer was simple and practical. The house became an asset tied to my work and my name, not an altar to a version of family that only functioned if I stayed small. Once those decisions were in motion, I stepped back from the rest. Calls went unanswered. Messages that tried to paint me as cruel or ungrateful stayed unopened. I told relatives I was done standing trial in conversations where the verdict had already been written. The distance felt strange at first, but it was the most honest thing I had ever done with them. Looking back, the turning point was not a single notice or the sound of a tow truck. It was the moment I stopped volunteering to disappear so everyone else could stay comfortable. Paying off that mortgage showed me how easily love can be used to excuse taking. Taking control of what I built showed me that love without respect is not a debt I owe to anyone, even if we share a roof or a last name. If there is anything I want someone listening to remember, it is this: choosing yourself is not harmful. Sometimes it is the first truthful thing you do for both your family and yourself. Sometimes it is the first time you can be proud not just of what you built but also of how you protect it. And sometimes, it is the moment when the story that belongs to you finally becomes real, clear, and unchangeable.